Hi, everyone. My name is Mona Bhan. I am an associate professor of anthropology and the Ford Maxwell Professor of South Asian Studies at Syracuse University. My research interests are, I have been working in the Kashmir region. I'm also from there for the past, I've been working there for the past 20, 22 years, basically looking at issues of border wars and counterinsurgency, militarism and humanitarianism, the intersections between the two, race, gender, religion, and environmentalism and climate change. In addition to, of course, my ongoing research project is on disputed waters between India and Pakistan, particularly looking at the 330 megawatt dam that has been built by India on the Kishanganga Dam, which is a disputed river between India and Pakistan, and also a river shared by both these countries. More broadly, my work has explored the role of economic and infrastructural development in counterinsurgency operations and people's resistance movements to protracted war and conflict. My first book, entitled Counterinsurgency Development and the Politics of Identity, from Warfare to Welfare, examined the relationship between everyday forms of militarization and social life in Kashmir, with a focus on how state-based economic development and environmental interventions normalize everyday forms of violence through registers of care, compassion, and humanitarianism. In 2018, I co-authored with an archaeologist, Andrew Bauer, a book entitled Climate Without Nature, A Critical Anthropology of the Anthropocene. So the focus of this book was to challenge the modernist binaries between nature and humanity and offer a situated and place-based assessment of how human and non-human entanglements produce climate assemblages across space and time. I consider myself to be an engaged anthropologist, which means I work with communities and people on the ground to collaboratively figure out solutions, radical solutions to political change, and rethink environmental issues within the context of prolonged political conflict. And that's work I've been doing for the last 5-7 years in collaboration with many communities on the ground. So I want to actually use today's opportunity to highlight some of the ways in which the Indian military's occupation, actually, before I do that, I would like to share my screen so that, I'm sorry, can I share my screen for photos?
Go ahead.
Thank you. All right, so I want to highlight some of the ways in which the Indian military's military bootprint in Kashmir, a Muslim majority region in the northwest Himalayas, and also the densest military occupation in the world, both produces far-reaching anthropogenic climate changes, in addition to worsening people's vulnerabilities to its devastating impacts. So Kashmir is an occupied territory over which India, Pakistan, and China exert competing claims and have fought, at least India and Pakistan, they've fought 4 wars over this region. Kashmir was a princely state under the British, and after India's partition, Kashmir's Hindu Dogra king, who ruled over this Muslim majority region, chose to provisionally accede to India. The UN recognized, however, that Kashmiri people would have a right eventually to decide their political future. And there were several political resolutions that were passed granting Kashmiris the right to self-determination. However, over the years, India has claimed, instead of recognizing the provisionality of that accession, India has claimed that Kashmir's accession to India was permanent and has stationed roughly 700,000. In fact, the number has gone up substantially in the last 2 years, and I'll discuss why that's the case. But there are at least 800 to 900,000 troops that are imposing India's will over Kashmiri people. And the military, of course, played a huge part in quelling an armed struggle for India's for Kashmir's independence from India in the 90s. But since then, of course, the military has clamped down on people's expression, political expression that that violates, according to India, Kashmir's status within the Indian Union, because according to India, based on the permanence of the accession, they consider Kashmir to be India's integral part. Now, the political situation worsened substantially in August of 2019 when the Indian state unilaterally revoked certain constitutional provisions that maintained Kashmir's semi-autonomous status in the Indian Union and allowed Kashmiris some control over their land rights and ownership of property. Also, the Kashmiri State Assembly had the right to decide who was a citizen of Kashmir. So these were some very important changes that were introduced in August of 2019. And they were introduced when the entire region of Kashmir was clamped down entirely through curfews, through this total silencing of people's expression and dissent. So with these new special provisions revoked and new citizenship and domicile laws in place under India's Hindu majoritarian leadership, helmed by Narendra Modi, Kashmiris now are experiencing the full wrath of India's settler colonial politics. As the Indian government has legally allowed Indians now to buy land and property in Kashmir and opened the floodgates for India's extractive projects, with devastating implications, of course, for Kashmir's already damaged ecology. So, just a few things I want to mention here that stand out. Of course, the reign of oppression by the Indian military has had a much longer history, dating back, of course, to the 1980s, but even before, to the 1950s and the 60s. But for now, in the last 2 years in particular, just the slew of changes, the pace has been dizzying. And there's some very critical changes on the ground that are shifting regimes of ownership and property access for local communities. So apart from a prolonged ban on the 4G internet and more draconian policies now, of course, that have been instituted for the last year under the pretext of battling a public health crisis, India has intensified its business as usual policies in ways that dispossesses Kashmiris of their precious land and water resources. Kashmiris now are being outbid by Indian competitors who are investing big money and benefiting immensely from a prolonged militarized lockdown that lasted more than a year and military patronage. In August of last year, now I would say a year and a half ago, Genocide Watch issued a genocide alert for Kashmir in order to highlight the long-standing human rights abuses and threats of life, as well as more recent assaults on people's lives and liberty. So this is just to set up the larger context of what's been happening in the Kashmir region, not just in terms of the disputed accession, but also more recently in terms of these recent laws that have been passed to disenfranchise Kashmiri populations even further, Muslim populations in particular, in a predominantly Hindu fascist / majoritarian state. So I want to make 3 big points today in my presentation, and these are general points, and I hope to also speak to these points through some examples that might allow listeners who are not aware of the situation in Kashmir a little more insight into what's been going on in this region, both politically as well as ecologically. So one point that I want to make is that any account of climate change and environmental justice issues cannot be fully addressed without also locating them within frameworks of political justice. In Kashmir's case, it means that environmental justice and questions of resource and political sovereignty, as well as people's long-standing struggle for self-determination, they go hand in hand. Anything short of that can reproduce. And if we don't do that, if we don't situate these ecological crises within the prolonged political crisis in the region, we end up reproducing climate change or environmentalism or environmental justice as weak alibis for a political status quo that intensifies marginalities as it leaves unaddressed the damaging impacts of a continued military occupation. In other words, the concept of environmental justice is not very meaningful unless it transcends narrow concerns with environmental protection and sustainability. Instead, in Kashmir, and as in other politically fragile and sensitive spaces, a vision of environmental justice must also include the Kashmiri rights to political sovereignty. So any understanding of climate change without addressing questions of settler colonialism or occupation or militarism more broadly are just not sufficient. So that's the first point. The second point I want to make is, often when I present on Kashmir in international spaces, the question that I often get is, why should the world care about Kashmir and about India's illegal occupation of the region? And my response to that, I mean, I have a multi-pronged response to that, but I want to say this right now as we are battling a global pandemic, that the relevance of this issue for the entire world could not be clearer as it is now. When we realize that while borders might allow us to keep people out, keep issues out, they do very little or rather prove absolutely ineffective when it comes to dealing with non-human forces, be it viruses, acid rain, plastic rain or acid rain, or the implications of deforestation, of glacial melting in the longue durée. As climate change wreaks havoc around the globe and also leads to, and again, I'd like to perhaps at some point, if time allows, speak to the connection also between climate change and pandemics, and why we need to think of public health crises in relation to the climate crisis that we are witnessing. So as we see these pandemics and the climate crisis wreaking havoc around the globe, we have to consider new and creative forms of solidarity and internationalism, and recognize that militarism and the climate crisis are indeed intertwined and mutually reinforcing. So militarism or settler colonial politics in a place like Kashmir has, I would argue, a direct bearing on what's happening here as well, both politically but ecologically, and that it's the ecological angle that I want to foreground. A recent study from Brown University's Cost of War project showed how the US Department of Defense has a large annual carbon footprint than most countries on Earth. The US military, they argued, is the single biggest emitter of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the world. Since 2001, the US military is estimated to have emitted a staggering 1.2 billion tons of carbon into the atmosphere. If one wonders, what if we were to take the cumulative impact of decades of intensive militarization of Kashmir into account and calculate its military footprint, what kinds of statistics would that generate? And I'm hoping at some point in the future, when the pandemic allows, we could perhaps map out a project like this, because it is very critical that we at least know the extent, the scale, and the depth of damage that the continued military occupation of Kashmir has inflicted on global ecology. The third point I want to emphasize here is that Kashmiri perspectives are indigenous perspectives. People's knowledge of their surroundings, of their environment, of their resources is rooted in land and its knowledge systems, locally situated ways of being and becoming, compared to settler colonial frameworks that guide India's extractive projects in the region. especially now that its constitutional autonomy has been eroded. So the need to develop radical ecological frameworks and action, therefore, fundamentally, again, I'm reiterating the point, need to be anti-militaristic and anti-occupation at their core, while these frameworks recognize the space for indigenous knowledge systems. And when I use the word indigenous here, I'm not necessarily only talking about the sense of rootedness to land, because that's come under a lot of flack from indigenous scholars. But what I'm more interested in presenting is this idea of indigeneity that is born out of this deep connection, deep intimacy or relationality or relatedness to land, to resources, to water, to mountains, and to glaciers. And I'll make a point about this later on in the presentation as well. What I want to really then argue is how these militarized borders of Kashmir and the investments, both by India and Pakistan and China, by these warring nation states, how these wars and these border infrastructures have exacerbated some of the worst climate-related disasters and vulnerabilities in this region. Since 1947, when India gained its independence and Kashmir was provisionally accessed to India, Kashmir's political landscape has been divided, it's been carved up and sliced between India, Pakistan, and China. And as is the case elsewhere, anywhere where you have fragmented political landscapes, the borders, these fragmentations pose some of the greatest challenges to coming up with climate change resolutions or climate change initiatives that can really focus on bringing the communities together, even bringing the states together in thinking about the ecology rather than only protecting the borders. For example, so apart from Kashmir's land, Kashmir's rivers and glaciers were also sliced up and distributed between the two nation states without Kashmiris having any say in any say in the distribution of these resources between these enemy or these warring nation states. So for example, I want to quickly talk about the Siachen Glacier, which is considered the 76 square kilometer glacier, where both India and Pakistan spend around $50 million a day to keep their military presence in this fragile, unpopulated glacier, where soldiers actually are barely battling each other, but what they end up battling more is the sub-zero weather conditions of the glacier. So at 18,000 feet, the Indian military officials have themselves described the Siachen Glacier as the world's biggest and highest rubbish dump. The only advantage, of course, of stationing the military advantage for India is that it prevents a direct link between China and Pakistan. Environmental experts say that heavy military presence is speeding up the melting of this glacier. And this is one of the world's largest glaciers outside the polar regions. And this military presence is also, of course, leaching poisonous materials into the Indus River Basin that it supplies water to. Since the 1980s, more than 30% of this glacier has melted because of the military's heavy bootprint in the region. And geologists have argued that glaciers in Kashmir retreated more and are losing mass at a greater speed compared to other Himalayan glaciers in India and elsewhere. And this is in large part because of course, extensive deforestation and land use practices in which agricultural land is transformed into concrete infrastructure, which of course includes military infrastructure for the most part, such as this one. You see this high altitude warfare school, for example, as just one illustration of how a grassland, a prairie or a meadow is completely transformed into a military into a garrison site. So a major report released earlier, a few years ago, found that rising temperatures will melt at least a third of the region's glaciers by 2100, even if average global temperature rises are limited to 1.5 degrees centigrade. So this is just a part of what's happening with Kashmir's glaciers, where the fragmentation of these glaciers, the securitization of these glaciers is exacerbating climate-related vulnerabilities, but also, as I said earlier, making it impossible for these nation states to come together to to figure out some long-term resolutions to the issue. But more importantly, more than the nation states coming together, it's also actually preventing communities who are bearing the brunt of a lot of these, quote unquote, natural disasters that are becoming more frequent, more common in the form of flash floods, in the form of earthquakes, in the form of droughts. Even it's preventing communities from engaging with each other to create a sustainable, situated solutions to such crises. So apart from these glaciers, though, Kashmir's rivers have also been divided and turned into hostile borders. And that's here I'm deriving a lot from my own research. As I said, I work on these contested dams that India is building on this disputed system, Indus River system. And I'll explain in a second what you are seeing on this map. So the Indus River Basin is shared by 4 countries, Afghanistan, China, India, and Pakistan, with the largest portion of the basin lying in Pakistan. So around 52% of the basin is in Pakistan and around 33% of it is in India. It's considered to be the lifeblood of Pakistan, and it supports and nurtures a population of around 215 million people. And any disruption in its flows and volume obviously can wreak havoc on people's lives and livelihoods, especially in Pakistan, which is the lower riparian in this schema. In recent years, there have been rising concerns about a water war between the 2 nation states, with Modi's belligerent rhetoric about dams being instruments of defense and warfare. So let me kind of quickly give you a little more background to this. So in the 1960s, because of what happened after 1947, after India and Pakistan were partitioned, the rivers, it was not clear how the rivers would be partitioned and who would lay claims to these rivers. So in the 1960s, there was a World Bank mediated treaty signed between India and Pakistan that essentially said this. They said, the 6 rivers of the Indus River system, what Pakistan will have is they'll have consumptive rights over rivers of the western rivers of the basin. So the 3 western rivers are the Jhelum, the Chenab, and the Indus. And India will have consumptive rights over Ravi, Beas, and Satluj. So they essentially, according to the treaty, the entire rivers, the flows of entire rivers were allocated to a nation state. And of course, this treaty was rather successful in settling down some of these water disputes that had become a little more frequent before the 1960s between India and Pakistan. So this is often hailed as a peace treaty. But for Kashmiris, the situation is hardly of peace, because what Kashmiris found clearly was that the treaty had no place for them. And these are rivers that a lot of these rivers flow through Kashmir. And for Kashmiris to not have any say, not to have any rights in this, according to this treaty, was of course seen as a complete sort of disenfranchisement of their fundamental rights to water. So what happened was, despite it being eulogized and extolled for maintaining peace between India and Pakistan, it ended up, the treaty itself one, is silent on Kashmir, and two, is completely silent on issues of climate change. Because at the time, of course, climate change was not something that people were grappling with. Not that they are even today, but this was more so the case in the past, that climate change was sort of a non-issue. And Kashmir clearly had to be extricated from this treaty for both India and Pakistan to agree on the terms of this treaty. If for them, the idea was, well, if we actually speak to Kashmir or speak about Kashmir, then the treaty will not happen. So for the treaty to be successful, so to speak, Kashmir's rights to this water or Kashmir's political disputed status had to be ignored, right? So for a lot of people, and for a lot of Kashmiri people, this is indeed hardly a peace treaty. It's a treaty that has sanctioned both India and Pakistan's violent control over a critical river system. So a treaty, as I said, just to summarize, it has effectively silenced Kashmiri claims over their river systems and normalized the two-nation state control over these rivers, apportioning entire rivers to either India and Pakistan. But for Kashmiris who have been struggling to, of course, make their struggle known, what they're also, of course, struggling with is the fact that these dams that India is building on these contested rivers, only 12% of that electricity comes back to Kashmir. Most of it then is shipped off or supplied to the northern grid in Delhi. And in fact, the people that I work with in Gurez, which is a border, it's a set of border villages that I work in that are on the disputed line of control between India and Pakistan. For them, they don't even get that 12%. They still don't have gridded electricity. They still rely, of course, on a diesel generator that provides electricity for maybe a few hours a day. So that's part of how this Indian control over Kashmiri rivers has, of course, as I said, dispossessed Kashmiris of their basic rights to water. And this is the case, obviously, from the 1940s onwards, but in the last 2 years, after the abrogation of Articles 35A and 370 that ensured Kashmir's semi-autonomous status within the Indian Union, the Indian government has now sanctioned even more projects and fast-tracked the development of these hydropower projects, even as we've witnessed colossal tragedies in the state of Uttarakhand, for example, just a few weeks ago now, or maybe a little more than a few weeks ago, which was clearly attributed to the construction of a hydroelectricity dam. But if you speak with officials, if you speak with engineers, which is what I've done as part of my own research, they just don't see dams wreaking much havoc on the ecology. On the contrary, dams are still seen as a sort of bulwark against floods, as a support structure against floods. And more importantly, hydropower is still seen as clean energy and as a sustainable form of energy, because unfortunately, compared to coal, it's seen as this much cleaner, sustainable energy. But of course, what is not taken into account is the carbon footprint of literally drilling the earth and putting more pressure on these tectonic plates that then lead to more earthquakes and so on and so forth. And this is also just, for those of you who might still feel that hydropower is a clean form of energy, we don't take into account the human displacements, right? We don't factor those into our assessments of whether or not hydropower is indeed clean or not. That's part of it. But also, I've often heard scientists and engineers tell me that no, of course, dams create no earthquake-related vulnerabilities. But there've been study after study to prove the point that it's not just one dam that's being built, right? You have to consider the cumulative effect of multiple dams that are being built on these rivers in the Himalayan region. These are dams, of course, being built by China, by Pakistan, as well as by India. And it is the cumulative pressure of all these dams on the tectonic plates that then makes this region even more prone to earthquakes than it already is. It is sitting on a massive fault line already, and the shifts, the infrastructural force of dams is something that we'll have to deal with in the near future. So that's part of what I do. But other than that, other than focusing on these border wars, right, or how infrastructure becomes a tool of border wars between India and Pakistan and how it impacts Kashmiris, I also want to speak to how Kashmiris have already felt that Indian government has launched an infrastructural war on a day-to-day basis on Kashmiris. And here I want to show you this one or couple of images where you have, this is the line of control, as I said, that fragments space and splits Kashmir into Indian-controlled Kashmir and Pakistan-administered Kashmir, making any kind of a conversation, political conversation between communities or ecological conversation between communities impossible. So it is, so what I'm really arguing is that there's this border infrastructure that impedes people's movement, impedes people's access to resources, but then there's this other form of infrastructure imposing India's might on Kashmiris, and these are everyday forms of infrastructure that could include concertina wire, such as this one, that really just you see everywhere in Kashmir, impeding people's access to critical centers, hospitals, healthcare, I mean, you name it. So the military troops, they are stationed not just in the border areas of Kashmir, of course, or along the line of control. Actually, it's not even a border area. It's not an internationally recognized border. So I'm calling it borders, but it's not really truly a border yet, because it is a disputed line of control. It's a de facto border that splits Kashmir, Pakistan administered Kashmir from the Indian one. But apart from that, there are these military troops stationed in urban and rural areas, as well as on agricultural lands, orchards, meadows, and grasslands, and highland pastures. And there's a deliberate attempt on a day-to-day basis by the Indian military to limit people's access to access to important institutions or resources through gridding, enclosures, land grab policies, and other interventions that dispossess populations and damage local ecologies and the fragile web of relationships between humans, animals, and plant species. And already, in a sense, what I'm really trying to say then is that in an already fragile ecology or an ecological landscape, what these policies, right, do is devastate the local fabric, social, political, ecological fabric, and therefore any sort of event, any kind of a natural disaster in this region, such as a flood or an earthquake, can never solely be seen as a natural disaster. It's a political disaster. It's a disaster that is born out of years of military occupation in the region. And one of the key examples of that was the flood of the floods that wreaked havoc on Kashmiris in 2014. And this was, to me, one of the first times that Kashmiris were actively linking natural disasters with political conflict. This was the first time I felt a large majority of the Kashmiri population was linking those floods to the political ad hocism of the state, to the client regimes that have been supported by the Indian government over the last 70 odd years, and to their very short-sighted policy to manage populations, to control populations, rather than to develop the infrastructure in ways that could benefit the local population. So most infrastructure in the valley right now has been built to support the freer movement of the military. So it's been completely, the entire region has been turned into a securitized, heavily militarized landscape. So while all this is happening, it's also very important to note here that there's a concerted attempt, especially now, under the right-wing Hindu fascist regime, to frame Kashmir as a wholly Hindu land. I mean, this is not to say that this was not the case prior to the BJP or Modi coming to power, but it's just it's accentuated, right? It has become even more prominent now that the Hindu state is in power. And there's a concerted attempt to redefine Kashmir as the fountainhead of the Hindu civilization, as the the origin, right, of Hinduness. So, why is that important to thinking about politics and ecology of Kashmir in the same breath? Is because there's concerted attempts also to start these new Hindu pilgrimage yatras or pilgrimage travels to all sides. There's already, of course, as I said, this was happening even before the BJP came to power, but now you see that happening more so than before. So, for example, there's something called the Amarnath Yatra, which is a Hindu yatra to a glacial site. And, it used to be that way back in the 1980s, there'd be around 12,000 people who would visit from all over India. But now that's been scaled up so much that you would have at any time, I would say, 700,000 people visiting or more this glacial site. So that's a staggering, 52 to 60 fold increase. And there are other sites in the Himalayas too, but we haven't seen this kind of a staggering increase in the number of Hindu pilgrims visiting those sites. So it's very clear when you look at the Amarnath Yatra and the Amarnath pilgrimage, Hindu pilgrimage, it's clearly a political yatra. It's not just about religion, it's about fusing this idea of Kashmir as a sacred landscape with the political intent to control it and to make it part of this Indian spiritual cartography, if you will. And so going back to this point that I've been trying to make, is therefore, I mean, a lot of people would argue, well, yes, the yatra is happening, but we are also trying to green the yatra. We have trees that we've planted. We have, for example, done things to make this ecologically more sustainable. But the fundamental question that gets erased in such greenwashing attempts by a lot of seemingly liberal groups is the fact that the fundamental logic remains uninterrogated. The idea that it is indeed a political yatra, it's a politicized version of, it's a politicized, what you call reconfiguration, right, of this sacred trip with the intent, of course, to control Kashmir and to claim it as Indian territory. So these cosmetic fixes then, which are all about planting trees in the Siachen Glacier or attempting to green the yatra, are therefore at best cosmetic fixes, right? And what they do indeed is hardly change anything, but indeed what they do is reveal, right, the brutal violence or the brutal face of an occupying settler state. They bring it into sharper relief. It is also what critics in the US sometimes call this armed lifeboat approach to the climate crisis. That you in fact bring in more military to do these beautification drives, to do these greening drives, if you will. So you're bringing in more military, you're spending more resources into the military and creating an armed lifeboat approach to an impending crisis. The other danger, of course, is that with climate change in this region becoming, a force to reckon with, increasingly becoming a force to reckon with, the other danger here is that we end up securitizing the climate discourse so much that climate change is seen now as a threat to national security. If at all, there's a gesture to understanding the implications of climate change. It's seen in a very reductive manner as a threat to national security. Instead, and because it's seen as that, because it's seen as a threat to national security rather than as a threat to humanity and our ecology more broadly, what's happening is more militarized solutions are being fabricated, or more militarized solutions are coming up to battle, to deal with the consequences of climate change. And this is, of course, very different from, let's say, coming back to my earlier point about why we need to take into account indigenous cosmologies or indigenous lifeways or indigenous knowledge systems that can help us understand how people themselves who are living on the ground, who are living with these glaciers, living with landscapes, living with rivers, how they themselves conceptualize climate change or glacial melting as an aspect of that. So for the folks that I work with, oftentimes when I ask them what they thought of their melting glaciers, and a lot of them just completely agreed that there's not even an iota of doubt in their minds that these glaciers were indeed melting, because they'd seen them being denser and whiter just a decade ago, and they had now become bare, dirtied, dusty. So they could clearly, point out the differences in how these glaciers even looked. Their vitality was compromised in their minds. But when you ask them why that was the case, they would often tell me that because they had lost their homes, like glaciers had lost their homes. And that really meant, of course, that they were pointing to the context of extensive deforestation that has been the case in this region. A large part of deforestation has happened because, as I said earlier, meadows need to be cleared up, forests need to be cleared up to install a heavy military presence and infrastructure in these regions. But more so, for people that I work with in these local communities, they would often say to me that the glaciers were melting because they were angry, right? So they didn't necessarily think of glaciers beyond these, socially significant ways to imagine them as having distinct personalities. There was this kind of an anthropomorphization, if you will. They were seen as having human-like characteristics, such as anger, and something they were clearly displaying. And when you ask them why they were angry, the rationale was that it was because of the incessant wars that they have witnessed, the extensive militarization that they have witnessed, the shelling, the bombing, and that's really made them angry. So they just melting because of that. Now, of course, if you were to take this explanation to an engineer, to a climate scientist, they might completely ignore it as just some mythic anecdotal story. But it is fascinating to me as an anthropologist, right, to look at this story, to look at this anecdote, to see this connection that is being drawn between an angry glacier and militarism, and recognize that for someone living so closely, living socially with the glacier, thinking about militarism and climate change are not it's not some kind of an epiphany. It's an everyday reality for them. So for me, that's where my theory comes from, right? That we cannot look at climate change or melting glaciers without recognizing the larger context of political violence and settler colonialism or occupation in this region. So what these localized indigenous perspectives then help us understand is how we can understand, we can analyze climate change beyond its technical factors alone and see how it is indeed shaped by political forces. The way people draw these connections between politics and ecology and vice versa is, to me, a fundamental way to decolonize conversations on climate change and environmental crises. So Kashmiris, going back to my sort of final point, so Kashmiris are the ones who bear the disproportionate burdens of colonial cartographies. And but now it's the time, it is high time to decolonize conversations on climate change. And how do we do that is by moving beyond binarized logics that treat humans and nature as separate entities, and then pretend that we can have any radical and inclusive form of environmental justice possible without upending the structures of occupation and settler colonialism. So coming back to my final point again, that in order for any sort of a radical change to happen, we do need to politicize climate change. We need to decolonize understandings of climate change by taking very seriously the perspectives that local communities who have this, ethic of sharing and caring with their surroundings can offer us. I'll just stop on that note. Thank you.